On the 26th of January 1788, Arthur Phillip landed the First Fleet and raised the Union Jack at Sydney Cove. Now, that date has come to be known as Australia Day. However, the day has become rather controversial, at least in the eyes of some. And it begs the question of whether we should change the date of Australia Day or abolish it entirely. And this debate reaches a crescendo every 26th of January. Often, this is marked by councils refusing to hold citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. In 2024, it featured Woolworths and Aldi declining to sell Australia Day merchandise. There appears to be a steady attempt to make Australia Day seem controversial, and thus nudge Australians toward thinking the date should change. The more you repeat something, the more people might start to believe it. However, this doesn't actually seem to be working. According to a recent poll by the Institute of Public Affairs, at least 80% of people are happy to leave Australia Day as it is. Only a minority of people actually want to move the date. But polling aside, is there actually an argument for moving Australia Day? Well, it turns out there really isn't, and the argument for moving it is relatively weak. The main argument pertains to Indigenous Australians. The argument runs that Australia Day is regarded as Invasion Day by some Indigenous Australians. And the argument goes that changing the date is just a minor change, a modest change, an outstretched hand, a gracious gesture that would not adversely impact anyone. So why not change it? Indigenous Australians account for about 3% of the population. Now, not all Indigenous Australians actually want to change the date, of course. For example, Warren Mundine and Jacinta Nampijinpa Price don't appear to want to change it. But it is plausible that a majority of Indigenous Australians do perceive 26th of January as the date in which the British colonised Australia, thereby harming the Indigenous population, at least as they perceive it. As indicated, not all Indigenous Australians believe this. Jacinta Nampijinpa Price believes that colonialism was actually good for Indigenous Australians, as she remarked during the referendum debate in 2023.
In your speech, you claimed some Indigenous organisations, quote, want to demonise colonial settlement. Could I ask you, please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. I mean, everything that my grandfather had when he was growing up, because he first saw whitefellas in his early adolescence, we now have. Otherwise, he would have had to live off the land, provide for his family, and all of those measures, which Aboriginal Australians, many of us, have the same opportunities as all other Australians in this country. And we certainly have probably one of the greatest systems around the world in terms of the democratic structure in comparison to other countries. It is why migrants come to flock to Australia to call Australia home, because the opportunity that exists for all Australians. But if we keep telling Aboriginal people that they are victims, well, we are effectively removing their agency and then giving them the expectation that someone else is responsible for their lives. That is the worst possible thing you can do to any human being, is tell them that they are a victim without agency. And that's what I refuse to do.
So you don't believe that... As a quick follow-up, you don't believe there's any negative ongoing impacts of colonisation on Indigenous Australians today? Just to confirm.
No, there's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation. What I will say, which I have suggested obviously within my speech, is that particularly for my family in remote communities, again, who live very close to traditional culture, who experience the highest rates of violence in the country, family violence, interpersonal violence, they experience that not because of the effects of colonisation, but because it's expected that young girls are married off to older husbands in arranged marriages. Women, we haven't had a feminist movement for Aboriginal women because we've been expected to toe the line when it's come to Aboriginal activism for the rights of our race, but the rights as women have been second place.
Nevertheless, the argument persists that Australia Day is a negative for Indigenous Australians, re-traumatising Indigenous Australians about colonialism, and thus the day should be moved or abolished. Presumably the proposal would be to replace the day with one chosen by Indigenous Australians. After all, how else would you solve this alleged problem? Now, Indigenous Australians notably account for about 3% of the population. So it would appear, therefore, that about 3% of the population would be determining what the new Australia Day is going to be. Now, aside from whether or not that's democratically viable, there are several underlying issues with this, and they arise from the implicit assumptions underlying the argument for moving Australia Day. And those implicit assumptions don't really hold up to scrutiny. First, it assumes we can agree on an alternative date for Australia Day. Presumably, there must be some agreement about this alternative date for it to take hold. After all, what are we replacing the 26th of January actually with? For something as fundamental as Australia Day, furthermore, it should at least be done via a plebiscite. You would hardly want to change the Australia Day without having a majority of Australians actually agreeing on what the new day should be. It shouldn't involve Parliament dictating such a day, and it shouldn't involve a small portion of the population stating what the day should be. Rather, it would need to be determined via a plebiscite or potentially via a referendum or something similar, especially given this is such a long-lasting and potentially costly change to make. Now, the alternatives that are there aren't necessarily going to solve the underlying alleged problem with Australia Day. For example, we've got Federation on the 1st of January, or the passage of the Australia Acts in 1986, which came into effect on the 3rd of March, and these severed the UK's legislative and judicial oversight over Australia. Or we've also got the Statute of Westminster from 1942, which started that whole process. Or what about elevating Remembrance Day to a public holiday? Now, you can see several alternative candidates here. However, all of these candidates have the same issue that Australia Day would have. They all are premised on the idea that Australia exists in its current form under its current British system of government and British system of law, i.e., it presupposes Australia actually existing as it currently exists. Therefore, the objections raised about Australia Day would presumably also apply to these other dates. It seems, therefore, that the activists who are all too willing to attack Australia Day's date aren't necessarily attacking Australia Day per se. Rather, their attacks would apply more broadly, and there'd be an attack on the concept of Australia per se, rather than Australia Day itself. And this means you would not be able to find a viable alternative without it being dictated to you by a small portion of the population. Second, there are implicit symbolic problems with changing the day. Australia, as we know it now, simply would not exist without Arthur Phillip, the First Fleet, and the British. You, my audience, can listen to me because of the British legal system and economic system, which was brought to Australia from the UK. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and all of the other capital cities only exist because of the British. We all would not be here without the First Fleet, and our system of laws depends upon the British legal system. Therefore, the idea of moving Australia Day seems to be slightly implausible. It would appear to be a denial of what makes Australia fundamentally the current country that it is, what buttresses Australia's current legal, economic, and parliamentary system. It would therefore implicitly be an underlying attack on the very basis of Australia's economic and governmental system, and that is a major symbolic problem. Third, it assumes that it is costless to move the date. However, there are both explicit and implicit costs. The explicit cost, of course, is the time and labour involved in changing all of the government materials, undertaking studies about a new alternative date, the consultations, and the like, potentially the court cases that might arise. This is not cheap. The cost of the referendum in 2023 was $450 million. Do we genuinely believe that a task as large as determining a new day for Australia Day would be significantly cheaper? Then you add on the idea of changing all of the collateral, so you need to change the marketing materials and all of that in order for this to really get off the ground. It could be quite a costly excursion. There are also some significant implicit costs, both intangible and tangible. The intangible cost of changing the date is that it's an exercise in control. It's an attempt to impose activists' will on the majority of Australians. This is authoritarian. This is an intangible cost imposed upon all Australians, other than those that are making the dictate. Further, one wonders also what would happen after changing the date. This so-called slippery slope argument oftentimes is controversial. However, it very much comes into play here. It comes into play because there's no limiting principle. What next after changing the date? What stops the activists from moving on to the next thing? Do we move on to other dates, such as Anzac Day, for example, that might be deemed to be problematic? Does the fight then move on to relitigating the voice and the treaty? That is changing Australia Day simply a wedge to give rise to other issues? Or is it a wedge to perhaps cudgel Australians into accepting such things? In short, if you give an inch, activists will take a mile. It's better to say no early, rather than appeasing activists, because appeasement doesn't work. And even if you believe that changing the date is costless, what happens next? The activist strategy appears to be to pursue seemingly small, incremental changes that they think that people won't notice, that they can market as modest, that they can market as simply a gracious gesture or an outstretched hand. But when you add all of them up, they are fundamental shifts. And all of a sudden you realize you got from A to Z before you realized it. All of those incremental changes, moving from A to B to C, all add up, and all add up to a large change. So these incremental changes could lead to a more fundamental shift. And as we saw from the referendum, Australians don't really want that fundamental shift, the things such as voice or treaty. The activists could of course mitigate this argument if they were to articulate a clear and credible limiting principle, a reason why we should believe them, that they would stop at the date and not pursue other changes. However, at present, I simply wouldn't believe them. There's no reason to give the activists the benefit of the doubt here. There's no reason to believe that they would stop at Australia Day. As we saw with the voice referendum, underlying the voice was the goal to bring about treaty. Clearly, some of these moves are premised on a broader underlying goal. Therefore, it would appear the most prudent path is to keep Australia Day where it is. Why, after all, should the majority of Australians be bludgeoned into submission about changing the date by loud activists? And unless we genuinely believe that the activists will stop at changing the date of Australia Day, it would appear to be a huge risk to make that change. But do let me know your thoughts in the comments below.